And welcome. Thank you for joining us for our COVID-19 Business Impact webinar. I'm Whitney Roseborough, one of the marketing coordinators here at Squire. We are excited to have you joining us today. Before we begin, I want to point out a couple of things to you. Over in the Q&A section, I have shared some links to some of Squire's resources. We're here to help, and we know there are a lot of opportunities available to you. Now, let me introduce our awesome presenters to you today. First, we will have Megan, who will be helping out in the background. If you have any questions you'd like to ask in the Q&A section, she will be answering those for you, and she will also be popping in and giving commentary. Megan is a CPA and an advisory partner at Squire. She has over a decade of experience working with businesses across several industries, specializing in QuickBooks, consulting, and outsourced accounting services for manufacturing and distribution clients. We also have Mark Andrus. Mark is a manager in Squire's advisory department. He specializes in providing outsourced CFO and controller services to small to medium-sized businesses across the country and enjoys helping them develop tools and methodologies to help them achieve success. And finally, we have Shane Edwards. Shane is an advisory partner at Squire and the Salt Lake office managing partner. He provides CFO and transaction support services to private and public companies. So take it away, Shane.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. We'll jump right in. On the screen, hopefully everyone can see the agenda. We're going to talk just for a few minutes about the recent survey results. This had to do with the status of PPP funding prior to the additional relief package that was signed on April the 24th. We will also be talking about this new relief package for a few minutes. Then we'll move to some PPP forgiveness principles, but the focus of our presentation today will be applying the principles of PPP forgiveness to an actual case study using the Squire forgiveness tool. Once that is complete, we'll have a few wrap-up items to discuss, and if there's any open questions, we'll address those. Our goal is to address questions as they come in, so be sure and send those, and we'll be monitoring them. And there we go. So the first question from our survey of last week was, what is the current status, or what is the current PPP loan status? And I've highlighted to the right that approximately 48% of the individuals that responded that wanted a PPP loan still had not received the funding. And if you look down in the blue, you can see that 43% had actually received the funding or was at that point in time at some process in receiving the funding. So again, prior to the recent legislation that was passed, less than half of the respondents had been able to get access to PPP money. Of course, the SBA had some struggles yesterday accepting applications, but I understand they're up and running now. And hopefully those that are interested in applying can shortly be funded. It's also interesting to note that the breakout of where the respondents actually applied, it appeared that by far the majority of them applied with banks, particularly with a combination of large and local banks, and then a combination of other types of lenders and or brokers. So I think what we're going to do is do a follow-up survey once this next round of funding closes and see ultimately what percentage of the respondents were able to get the funding, at least those that were interested in obtaining it. Now moving on to the actual relief package that was signed on April the 24th. Great news for small businesses because they added another $320 billion to those that are interested in the funding. That is in addition to the $349 billion that was used up. It's expected that this new $320 billion allotment will be burned through in a week or two. We'll be monitoring that closely. There's some additional monies that were allocated to the bill, including some additional monies to the EIDL program. Now, moving forward to loan forgiveness, which again is the focus of our presentation today, you'll see on the screen 5 key questions that in principle need to be addressed as part of the loan forgiveness process. I'm going to click through my slide deck here, but there's a lot of content. I put a lot of content on because we're going to distribute the PowerPoint after the presentation, and I wanted the participants to have a good resource. So this is not something I'm going to read through, but just summarize the data, and then after the presentation and after the demonstration, you can go back and look at the details. So the first question is, what's eligible for forgiveness? Again, most of the people on the seminar today are probably familiar that it's the primary component is payroll costs. 75% of the costs, if you want forgiveness, need to relate to payroll. You're also allowed rent, utilities, and interest costs. There is still a lot of open questions as it relates to the definition of some of these terms and what is considered appropriate mortgage obligation, as you can read in quotes there. The SBA was supposed to come out with a clarification on the forgiveness calculations by the 26th, a deadline that they did not meet. But you'll hear a lot throughout the presentation and demonstration today that we're still waiting on further guidance. Now, once you collect your costs in other categories that were just presented, one of the items that needs to take place after you adjust, consider the 75% of your cost have to relate to payroll, is you need to make an adjustment for any reduction that you have in full-time equivalents. Again, on the screen, you see kind of a rather complex looking calculation, which takes us back to the algebra looking days, but the primary point here is in your numerator, you have a number of employees that existed prior to the 8-week forgiveness period. I'm sorry, in the denominator, which is why you have a number of people that existed prior to the 8-week forgiveness period. The numerator, which is X, is those full-time equivalents that you were able to retain. To the extent that that ratio is reduced, your forgiveness is also reduced. The next reduction calculation, the next possible reduction from forgiveness is called the reduction in compensation paid calculation. This is also unique in that the calculation, at least it appears, has to be done on an individual by individual basis. In other words, you just can't group all of your employees and look at cost reductions. If an individual employee is reduced by more than 25%, that begins to affect your forgiveness. It is good to know that, at least for now, that all of those individuals that make over $100,000 annually are not to be included in this calculation. This is another area, if you look at the bottom paragraph, there's still a lot of uncertainty as to how the actual reduction will take place. In other words, if you don't make the trigger, is there a possibility that you don't get any of your loan forgiven? Probably not the case. Or does it just reduce dollar per dollar pro rata based on to the extent that you're over the 25% cushion? Again, we're not sure. I'd mentioned that employees that make over $100,000 can be removed from the calculation. Now, this is an important point that I don't think a lot of individuals have considered, and that is there are these steps that you have to follow to determine how much of your loan is not forgiven. So the question becomes, in what order do you apply those steps? Again, the SBA has provided no guidance to us, but for purposes of our demonstration today, we're going to assume the steps that are outlined on the screen. I'll highlight them briefly. So step one is just gathering your expenses or projected expenses if you're doing this at the front end, and allocating them between payroll and non-payroll costs. The second step that could be a possibility is to test to see if you've met the 75-25% non-payroll to payroll relationship. You take the number that results from that, and then you reduce it for any headcount reductions. You take the number that results from that, reduce it for wage reductions, and then complete your calculation, which Mark Andrus will kind of follow through with us in the demonstration. So Mark, I'm going to turn the screen share over to you so you can educate the group on how you might apply these principles in an actual situation using a tool.
Okay, thank you, Shane. It's great to be with you all here today. The PPP loan, as you know, as money went out the door, and let me share my screen here. Okay. As money went out the door for the PPP loan, I don't think a ton of attention was paid to the details. As you know, if you already have your PPP loan, they kind of gave you what you asked for with a little bit of verification, but not a ton. And so money went out the door, and where we think they're going to be really careful, and the banker is going to be careful, is on the forgiveness calculations. So as Shane just went over those and what the details are there, I'd like to also reiterate that details are fuzzy on those, such as the order of operations and what exactly is included and excluded. But we're going to go through our calculation spreadsheet to give you an estimate of what of the PPP loan will be forgiven. I've started here with an example, and I've just kind of filled out this spreadsheet beforehand, showing you what the different payrolls are on here. And so let's go ahead and just look at the inputs here. So step one is initial input. We got a loan, a PPP loan for $75,000, and it was funded on 4/16 in our example. Then it wants to know what is our what is our payroll cycle? And we can choose a drop down here, and we've chosen monthly just because it will be easiest to get through the 8-week period with only 2 payrolls here. So we're going to show you what it would be like for a company with monthly payroll. And then it's just asking for the first date of the payroll after the funding. So we just fill in our information arbitrarily here, and then we're off, and we'll go ahead and fill in the rest of the inputs here, showing you step by step what the forgiveness calculation is going to entail. So I've used some familiar names here from the office, so we can kind of all just relate to the situation here. We've got how many employees here? We've got 7 employees: Michael Scott, Dwight Schrute, and so we're putting in here the hours that they've worked in the pay period. 173 is a full-time employee for a month. And then we've got some part-time employees down here. We have the gross pay that they were paid for this pay period all in here. And as we've talked about, anybody over 100,000 is excluded, not anybody, but any amount for any individual that's over 100,000 a year annualized gets excluded. So in our example of monthly payroll, anybody getting paid over $8,333.33 gets reduced to $833.33. So Michael Scott, instead of his $10,000, only gets we get forgiven $833.33. Everybody else is under that, as you can see, and gets paid by the hour. So we just fill in here what are the other payroll costs that would be forgivable. Would be the state unemployment insurance. This is the employer portion of retirement. That each of them, that the employer paid for each of them, and the employer portion of health insurance benefits. So we can either, these expenses right here, we could put in on an individual basis, or we could put them in on an aggregate basis at the end. So I've opted in this example to put them in on a per payroll basis. And so we would fill out 2 of these payrolls. And so this is the second tab of the payroll. This is the payroll that would be on 5/17. This one was on 4/17 after the funding, and 5/17. I saw one of the questions there is when is that payroll date? You know, how does that fit within the 8-week period? And I think it's important to note that we're not exactly sure, but we think that it's as cash leaves. So if this pay period ended on 4/15 and it got paid on 4/17 and you got the loan on 4/16, because this was the first payroll that got paid after you got the loan, we're assuming that's how it's going to work. Again, this could all change, and they could say, no, it all has to be payroll that was incurred during the 8-week period. But that would obviously extend the pay date or the fund date of payroll past the 8-week period. So we'll watch for guidance on that. But for right now, we're assuming as cash leaves the bank. And so this is the second payroll here. We kind of just kept everything the same. Then we're going to move over to the expense register. So the expense register here is, let's just track the expenses that came out of the bank that are PPP forgivable. And just have a place where we can see all of these expenses together. So during this period here from 4/16 to 6/10, the 8-week period, we had these 2 payrolls, and this was just pulling off the other tab with these expenses that are allowable. And this took down Michael Scott's salary down to 100,000 annualized. So the 833.33. Under the payroll section, then we're talking about non-payroll costs that would be forgivable. So during the 8-week period, we had the Scranton office rent payment twice, and we have utilities payment twice. So these would just be, let's have the bills ready to show for documentation on these, and just categorize these, and that moves these over. As you can see, they're in the non-payroll cost section here for rent or mortgage interest and utilities. And then down here, I would be able to, if I didn't want to put the retirement and health insurance benefits on a payroll on an individual basis, I could put the amounts over here just in aggregate as I paid them. So let's go over to then the next calculation here, which is the wage reduction. So let's look at their.
Mark,
yes.
This is Megan. Before we jump into reduction, can we talk through the rest of our eligible cost questions that have come up?
Sure.
And just make sure we know where those belong in the spreadsheet.
Yep.
Are you good to read them? And
I don't have them. Let me see.
okay, I'll read.
Okay, go ahead.
So you mentioned that the pay period on 4/17, which is 1 day after the funds were received, we think is going to be eligible. We already talked about how maybe it won't be. But the question we have here is, what if we've been kind of deferring wages because we didn't have the cash? Can we now catch those up, and how would we? I mean, and include them in our payroll during this 8-week period?
I think that's a good question. The look back period that you got your loan was based off of 2019 generally. But where they're going to look at the wage reduction, that question kind of is a wage reduction type question, because when we're looking at the wage reduction, it's comparing Q1, so through March 31st, 2020, and to see if we've reduced wages since then. So if you reduced wages before then the wage reduction might kick in there, and you might get a benefit there because you've rehired that person. But I think anything that you were able to spend on payroll up to the loan amount would be forgivable, if that makes sense. So right now there's no limit on hiring new people or paying people that you didn't pay before. So those would be included.
Okay. And then what if you can't hire employees, so you use a temp agency to hire staff? Are those allowable expenses?
That's a good question, and I don't know. With the temp agency, you do not have the W-2, right? They're not W-2 employees.
That is correct. Which is why my response would probably be No, they weren't included in the calculation originally, so I do not believe they're going to be included in the forgiveness calculation either. I think it has to be W-2 employees only.
And I would agree with that.
Okay. And then what about giving a bonus as part of or during this time?
So the guidance as we understand it right now is that if you normally paid out a bonus in this time period, you know, in the 8-week period, and this is in the normal course of operations, how you operated, then yes, you can give out a bonus. You can continue to give out a bonus in that time period. However, if you're giving out bonuses to just use the money and have that forgiven, we don't have clear guidance, but I don't think that they will allow it. What I've kind of been operating under the assumption, there's so many loopholes that right now you could take advantage of in the current way that the bill is structured, because it's just not addressed. But what we're advising people is to kind of just go by the spirit of the law and say, okay, what was this intended for? This is intended to keep the employees that we have and keep them paid at the wages that we were paying them before. We think that probably more guidance is going to come out to block some of these loopholes, and if you started trying to do it, you may get bitten on the back end trying to force some of these things through and take advantage of using the funds in a way that wasn't originally intended. So as of now, I don't know that there's any clear guidance that it would be disallowed and not forgiven. But again, I would caution on the side of staying safe.
Yeah, and I think this is a common question that is out there, and so I believe that they will rule on this when they give us more guidance, and for sure we'll be watching for this and trying to make our best recommendation based on what we learned from their new guidance. I would just tell anyone who's wondering about this is you've got, you know, at least probably 5 or 6 more weeks before the end of this 8-week is up, even if you've received funding. So sit on it and don't do anything that isn't already in place, like Mark mentioned, and then we can decide later whether the guidance allows for one-time bonuses, or in this case, they set a hazard pay bonus for those who had to come into the office, even amidst the risks. So.
Yep, I agree. And so the guidance really is saying whatever was incurred during this 8-week period. So then you can kind of move into the fact, well, I've got yearly bonuses, and can I pay out the portion that was of that bonus that was incurred during this 8 weeks? And that's, again, a question that is not covered under the current guidance, but they could definitely lean that way and say, yeah, you can pay out the portion of the bonus that was incurred during the 8 weeks.
Awesome. And can I throw one more question in there real quick?
Yep.
Let's see. They are looking at they have employees who aren't wanting to come back to work because of unemployment, which technically, if they are no longer furloughed, you've offered them the job, technically they shouldn't be eligible for unemployment anymore because now they've essentially quit. But the question is, we've got to get our head count back up. Our employees aren't coming back. So can I hire one of my kids to be a head count person and have them help us out? What are our thoughts there?
It's a good question, and I don't see any reason why not if there's a valid position for them. I don't know how much the bankers are going to dig into, you know, what was the necessity and what did your kid do while they were there. I don't know that they're going to have time to dig into all that and get down into the nitty gritty. But I would say if there's a valid position, there's valid work for them to be doing, that would probably be, and you put them on W-2, they're a W-2 employee on payroll, then I think that would be permissible. But again, you're going to have to go by the spirit of the law, because if your kid starts making more than anybody else in the company, they're going to kind of be looking at you sideways, I think. Shane, do you have any guidance on that?
I do not. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
It appears to me that, and this is where it gets a little confusing for people, is it, from my reading of the regulations, on the head count reduction calculation, you can replace employees. What's not clear is on the reduction in compensation paid calculation, if you're allowed or not allowed to hire replacement employees. It would make sense, Mark, given the spirit of the law, that would be permissible. But again, these calculations are based on an individual's compensation. So again, headcount reduction, I believe you can have replacements. On reduction in compensation paid calculation, the jury's still out.
Okay, thank you. So let's step into the reduction in wages analysis here. What the initial guidance is saying is that they're going to be comparing your annualized pay for the first quarter of 2020, so January to March 31st, 2020, annualize that pay that they received, and then let's make a comparison. So in these examples, I used this addendum over here and said, okay, what were my payrolls for the 3 months before? So this is January, February, March payrolls here. So I just put in amounts for everybody that they, fictitious amounts, obviously, that they got paid over those 3 months. And so what this tab here is looking at that and annualizing those 3 payrolls. What if they got paid that the entire year? And then comparing what we paid during the 8-week period, also on an annualized basis. It's important to note on this one, you do not have to include anyone that earned over $100,000 in this calculation as the wording stands now, meaning you could just take them completely off. Just to stay consistent, I put everybody on here so Michael Scott still appears on here, but if I were to reduce his wages, my formula here is not going to flag him as somebody that got reduced. So if you can look here in just this example, we've decided to keep everyone fairly consistent. These 2 hourly employees, obviously their hours fluctuated a little bit. Kevin didn't work as much during the 8-week period, but he did not drop below 25%. And that's what this spreadsheet is mainly looking at, is which employees were you paying during Q1 that you also paid in this 8-week period that dropped below an annualized ratio of 25% of what they were getting paid. And so we'll look at this, we'll fill in some examples here of what if we drop somebody below, but for right now we kept everybody kind of where they were, so there are no reductions in wages at this point, but we'll go back and show you what happens there. And so once we do those spreadsheets, then we're going to go over to the loan forgiveness calculation. This is kind of just where the rubber hits the road here. We can see how everything plays out. So my steps are just listed up here that Shane described, and then our summary information, what was the loan amount, beginning and end date of the loan. And now let's dig into the nitty gritty here and see step by step what happened. So during the 8-week period, we had set $63,000 in wages. 3,333 of that was not allowed because it was over the 100,000 for Michael Scott. You could fill in any cash tips, pay, severance, vacation, that information there if you needed to fill these in manually. And then we're going to look at the payment for healthcare benefits, and these are all feeding off of that tab. So we end up at total payroll cost of $61,932 for the 8-week period. Our non-payroll costs of rent and utilities, the spreadsheet figures out, okay, what would be the maximum allowable based on this number here? What is the other 25% I can go up to? And that would be 20,000 in this case based on that payroll number. So you can see we only have 11,000, which was 15% of the total payroll cost. Total loan amount spent. And so down here, the step 2, the calculation of the cost floor is, here's the total amount that was spent for loan purposes. The amount of the loan left unused was about $2,000. So you can see here we've got a forgivable balance and a non-forgivable balance. So the forgivable balance is at $72,000. Non-forgivable is the $2,000 that we just didn't spend because we had a $75,000 loan and we only spent $72,000 on related costs. So we track down here, we see the numerator. We'll just go over to the full-time equivalents here. And what we did was just say, let's total up their hours for the month and divide by the 173, which is a full-time person. So we had some of those part-time people where 2 part-time people can equal 1 full-time equivalent. So in our example, we had 6. If you remember, we had 7 employees, but the 2 part-times made up 1 full-time equivalent. And so we had 6 is the numerator. That's what we had during the 8-week period averaged. Now what the denominator of that is they're going to look back and see what was your full-time equivalent either for February 15, 2009 to June 30th, 2019 to June 30th, 2019, or we can choose from January 1st, 2020 to February 29th, 2020. So they give you the option there. Obviously, we're going to want to choose the one that has the lower full-time equivalent in it because that's what we're going to be comparing against. This one chose the lower, which was in January 2020 to February 2020. We only had 6 full-time equivalents and we still had just over 6. So there's no reduction there for a reduction in full-time equivalents. Reduction in, and nobody got reduced for 25% of the wages yet. We'll make that happen. And so there's no reduction there. And then in step 5 is just the did we restore people by June 30th? And here, again, is where we're looking for a lot of guidance to come through because technically, couldn't you hire somebody back on June 30th and start paying them June 30th and consider them a full-time headcount employee? But again, spirit of the law, it's hard to say what they're going to go off of there because you didn't, you could also fire them on July 1st, right? And so it's interesting here, and this is kind of the wild, wild west at the moment where we're going to look for some more guidance. So let's go back here and, Megan, do we have any questions to address before I go make some assumptions and reduce some people?
Yeah, I mean, we have several on headcount and then on some of these forgiveness adjustments. Are you wanting to go deep into some forgiveness things, or do you want to ask the questions now and then you can cover anything you don't have yet?
Let's go ahead and just do the adjustments and the scenarios, and then we can do Q&A after that.
Okay.
So let's go through here, and I'm going to first let an employee go. And so let's say by the second payroll, the first payroll we keep everybody, second payroll we let Kevin go. Let's go look and see what that did to our loan forgiveness. So we can see we're still within 75-25. However, at this point, let's go over to the reduction in wages so you can see what happened there. Because he got paid the first month and not the second month, we went below the 25% because he only earned a $7,200 annual salary. And so what it's doing here is saying, okay, you had a maximum allowable amount that you could go down to 25%. You need to make up the other 75%. So $923 needs to be is now going to be not forgiven if we keep Kevin unemployed there or we keep him laid off. And so also the headcount reduction, you can see here, we went down to 5.79 employees because he had the lowest amount of hours, but still we were below either of these thresholds here. So we're going to take a hit of 3%, and it's 3% of where we ended up on this calculation, which we didn't have any reduction there yet. Actually, we did have a little bit of, you can see here, we didn't spend as much on payroll anymore. So this not forgivable amount, just because we didn't spend it, already went down. So now that we're at 71,000 forgivable, we take 3% of that because the difference between those is 3. And now we have another $3,000 or $2,400 that is not forgiven or forgivable. That adds into our balance. And we have the $923 in allowance reduction that that we aren't able to take anymore, is not going to be forgiven. And so let's go ahead and bring Kevin back, and we will reduce, let's say we reduce Jim down to $3,000. You can see here again, now we reduced him below the 27, and we've got an amount to make up for him there. So our head count now is going to be still okay because we maintain the same amount of head count. If he's still a full-time employee, we could move him to hourly and say, okay, we reduced him $3,000, but now he's only part-time, so now he's only working 80 hours, and that would affect our head count calculation now. You can see now we went down below it again. And so let's bring Jim back up, and then let's say, actually no, let's keep Jim out, and then go back over to the wages analysis here, and let's do this analysis here. Were the wages restored or partially restored as of 6/30/20? So we could say yes, they were. And by 6/30/20, we brought Jim up to an annual salary again, let's say of $75,000. We now have an adjusted non-forgivable wages amount of $0. We're good there because 75 is within 25% of the 78 that we were paying him before. If we were to, I want to show you a couple things just with the non-payroll cost expense here. If we were to have rent that just went, is astronomical. Let's say we had 20,000 in rent for each month. We see here that our rent was 40,000, but it's above the allowable amount of 19,000 based on our payroll amount. So we would have to then reduce. You can still pay the rent, it's just not going to be forgivable, and you obviously they don't know if you're paying with PPP funds or your own funds, but this amount here, anything over this amount is not going to be allowed. So it's not saying that you can't pay rent if it makes you go over 25%, but our calculation here just reduces the amount of non-payroll costs so that they fit within your 25% bubble there. And if we were to decrease the amount, let's say we had really super low rent. Go back over to loan calculation. We can see that we're now at 95 and 3,000. But what happens is we are just spending less money because we didn't pay that extra. They gave you 2.5 months worth of payroll costs to cover only an 8-week period, and so they gave you a buffer to be able to cover the rent and utilities. That's what that was built in for. But if you do not spend it on rent and utilities and you have nothing else to spend it on as far as payroll or rent and utilities, it's just going to be a non-forgiven amount that you just didn't spend all the money that you made. And I have a couple of clients in that situation where they had much larger payrolls in 2019, and before any of this happened, even they moved a bunch of employees over to another company, and their payroll was just lower in general. So their loan amount that they got is a lot more than they're going to be able to spend. And that's really it. So every time this just boils down to what's your total estimated forgivable portion and what's your total non-estimated forgivable portion. And the spreadsheet just allows us to kind of play around with it and figure out, if we were to hire back a couple of employees and restore their wages, what would that do? So that's really my presentation on the forgiveness calculation. I think now we can turn it back over to Shane.
Well, before that, Megan, why don't you highlight some questions that have come up that perhaps Mark has not addressed?
Yep, let's go through our list of questions here. So
in the meantime, Mark, you can transfer control over to me so they can see my PowerPoint.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So we have a question. What about HB1 and opt? Meaning the visa employees, are there any limitations on their payroll qualifying?
I believe they have to be U.S. citizens. And so I'm not sure that a green card or visa employee would be able to be qualified. Shane, if you have any other guidance besides that, or Megan?
Well, it is clear that they have to be working in the United States.
Okay, just working.
It's not clear to me what their immigration status has to be in order to be included in the calculation.
Okay, the next question we have is If the only way we can convince employees to come to work is by paying hazard pay, meaning we're going to be paying them more than we were before, isn't that part of maintaining payroll? And that may be in the form of a bonus, or it may be in the form of higher wages.
Yep. And I would agree there. And again, it may just have to be a conversation you have with the banker where they may just ask you, hey, you raised this person. And then you can get into the discussion of hazard pay. And again, I don't know that we know the answer definitively.
Okay, and then we have several questions. So I would agree. We don't have a definitive answer on that. I would assume you need to get employees in the door, and so I think that whether it's forgiven or not, that extra pay, I think you have to weigh that against the fact that you need to have employees, right? And so hopefully we're hopeful that it will be forgiven, because we agree it's an important part of the situation right now, but we don't have a definitive answer on that one. So I'm going to move us on to some FTE questions. So can we talk about how FTEs are calculated, and are they based on what you reported on the PPP application, or are they based on a real numbers analysis of FTEs?
Maybe I can address that, Mark and Megan.
Yep.
So what we discovered is the number that was included on a lot of our clients' applications were calculated early in the process, and quite frankly, were just not accurate. So the numbers that will be used were those dates that Mark outlined, assuming you do not have seasonal employees. So the denominator in the calculation will either be the full-time equivalent employees, again to repeat, either from the periods February 15th, 2019 through June 30th, 19, or January 1st, 2020 through February 29th, 2020. It's also not clear what the definition of a full-time equivalent is. I think most people are ending up that a full-time person is someone that works 30 hours, because there's some other legislation that refers to 30 hours being a full-time employee. Mark, I believe in your case study, you assumed 40 hours, correct?
Yep, I used 40 hours, and I think we kind of landed on the fact that as long as you're consistent on what you use, I think it should result in the same general proportion of FTEs during those two periods, as long as you're comparing apples to apples. And then I think the bank is going to give you more stringent guidelines on how to calculate an FTE.
Yeah, and then on the numerator, on the full-time equivalent reduction calculation, you know, there's exceptions, but for the most part, you should use the average number of full-time equivalents employed from February 15th, 2020 to June 30th, 2020.
Okay. There is a bit of concern of employees who leave on their own, and whether that there will be, you'll be hurt on the forgiveness side and on the wage comparison side. How can we, what's our response there? You know, what if they quit? I don't really want to hire someone new because business is slow. Am I going to take a hit? Or what if they themselves reduce their hours and I decide to keep them on as employee at reduced hours, but it wasn't me putting that restriction on them. So what do we want to say in response to those kinds of questions?
Maybe Megan and Mark, perhaps I can jump in here as well. The legislation introduces a concept of a testing period. And I am going to direct those that are listening to this seminar to go to the squirecares.com website, find the frequently asked questions for loan forgiveness, and go to item number 12. I think my ability to effectively answer what we refer to as rehires or replacement employees is probably too too complex to describe verbally. But there are some provisions that if the reduction period happens during this testing period, you're given more latitude than otherwise. Short of that guidance, again, that is number 12 on the frequently asked questions for loan forgiveness.
Okay. Anything you want to add, Mark?
No, I'm just wondering if they might be looking at something similar to what are the qualifications for receiving unemployment, and if they no longer meet those qualifications because you reached out and asked them to come back and they opted not to, if somehow the bill might build in there, yeah, you don't have to take a hit for that employee, because as you saw in my my wages reduction analysis, we could hire 14 employees to replace one employee, but as long as we're not paying that specific employee, we're going to have to take a hit on their reduction in wages. And so that's the interesting part to me, to say, you know, if that employee quit under their own volition, then what can we do to not take that hit on the forgiveness? And I don't know right now, but I would like to see something where it's like, if that person no longer qualifies for unemployment because you've reached out and extended an offer to them, that maybe they might be forgiven again.
Yeah, and Mark, maybe I do need to jump into this exception a bit that I was deferred everybody to in the frequently asked questions. But and again, this relates to either rehires or replacements. So in your situation, this person just doesn't want to come back to work. If you lose employees during the period beginning February 15, 2020 and ending April 26, 2020, that results in a lower full-time employee count during the testing period than that of February 2020, then you can rehire the employees on or before you can rehire or replace the employees on or before June 30th, 2020. Again, that it's complex and it's difficult to explain in a verbal conversation, but I think Mark, to your point, I believe if people elect not to come back, you're going to have to replace them in order to meet the headcount calculation and or the wage reduction calculation. I don't think they're going to allow you to say, oh, well, your employees opted not to come back, we're going to give you a pass on those two tests.
Well, and one other thing that was brought up is that sometimes they're opting not to come back because of childcare. You know, under COVID, they're allowed to stay home. They're not necessarily quitting. They just have this leave that they're allowed to have. They maybe are allowed to stay on unemployment because of it, or they're staying home for childcare, or maybe they're sick themselves. And so we don't know what the overall guidance is going to be, because yeah, that's not the employer's. The employer can't control that, whether they're quitting because they don't want to come back to work, or if they are not coming back to work because they can't because of COVID. Then I mean, I think that we're hoping the guidance will address those different scenarios, and the hope is that we aren't penalizing every employer for things they can't control. I think the idea will be that hopefully you can control what your forgiveness will look like.
Well, Megan, should I proceed?
Oh, no, we have several more. Okay. So let's keep going. So if you spend, this is on forgiveness calculation for adjustments on it. If you spend 75% on payroll, assuming no reduction in staff, do you have to return any of the other 25% that wasn't spent on other allowable costs? Does that make sense? What the question is?
Yeah. So let's see.
Anything that wasn't spent on rent and utilities, in other words, right?
Right.
Yes. Yeah. I would say you will have to return anything that was not spent on either payroll costs or rent and utilities.
So even though you met the 70, I agree, just to restate, even though you met the 75% payroll calculation, and assuming that you didn't spend, there's nothing that precludes people from spending 100% on payroll, correct? Within the guidelines, right? Yep. It has to be at least 75%. But let's say that you've maxed out all the payroll that you can spend at 75%. Those the remaining 25%, if they're not spent on forgivable expenses, then they will reduce your the amount that is forgivable. What's not clear is if you do not meet the 75% trigger, and I alluded to this earlier, if you don't meet the 75% trigger, there's some, I'm not one of them, but there are some who say there's a risk that none of your loan could be forgiven, because the intent of the act generally was to have by far the bulk of the money going to keep people employed. So as you know, anybody getting a loan, really focus heavily on meeting that 75% trigger threshold in case the SBA comes out with some unusual reduction formula that's inordinate to the dollars spent.
Well, Shane, I would add to that, if you didn't spend it on payroll, then you just don't, and that scenario that you outlined comes to pass, you just don't report the other expenses, right? And it just is all not forgivable. The payroll will stay in at 75%. You just don't say, I spent the other, $40,000 on rent and this. You just didn't spend it, if that makes sense.
Right. You just have a loan for that amount.
Exactly.
That you could pay off,
Yep, and I think that's a good point as well. Is these loans are super cheap. I mean, 1%, and the clock doesn't start ticking on them for 6 months, and you have 2 years to repay them. So it's not the end of the world if something isn't forgivable either. Obviously, free money is better than a loan, but the loans are not a bad deal in the first place.
Right, that answers another one of the questions on that. That's great. Question on that 1%. Is it starting to accrue 1% now as soon as you receive the funds? And so by the time you get it forgiven, you may still owe interest anyway?
Yeah, the interest begins to accrue as soon as you receive the funds, but interest accrued during the 8-week period can be forgivable. Awesome.
Okay, the next question is, so you kind of talked about how you can spend more than the 75% for payroll. What about if you spend under the 75%? What does that look like? And does that preclude you from getting any of the non-payroll costs forgiven?
I would say no. I mean, you just take your payroll costs like you saw in my spreadsheet. You take your payroll costs and then you calculate what the other 25% would be based on what you paid in payroll. And then there's your bucket right there. If you fill that bucket, so be it. If not, then don't worry about it. But if you had other expenses that, rent expenses that or utilities that did qualify, they just don't qualify anymore. So you just cap it at whatever the other 25% is.
Just one comment, because I mentioned this earlier. There are some attorneys that have read the act and in detail and have interpreted. Again, I don't agree with them, but there's a clause in the act unrelated to forgiveness that says you need to spend 75% on payroll. Again, this part of the act had nothing to do with forgiveness. It just said the intention was to spend 75% on payroll, period. And those attorneys that read this imply that if you do not meet that threshold, there is a risk that none of the loan could be forgiven.
Are you saying, Shane, that 75% of the entire loan amount?
Yeah, so if you don't spend 75% of your expenditures during the 8-week period, right, don't meet the 75% threshold for payroll, some are saying that there could be a risk that none of the loan could be forgiven. So just an emphasis, that's not a scare tactic or anything, just I think people should be extra cautious to make sure that they focus on those payroll costs, get people in place, and meet the threshold. Again, it's a different interpretation, Mark, than you had. I'm just referring to some attorneys that I've done my research.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to clarify is it's if you got a loan amount for 100,000, but your payroll has been drastically reduced since then, and you were able to spend 50,000 on payroll, you're saying that because that's not 75% of the loan amount you received, then none of it is forgiven? Or can you say, well, we spent 50,000, so we only have 25,000 left to spend, or whatever it is, 20,000 to spend on non-utilities, and we spent 70, we're going to give the rest back?
The former.
Right. Okay. I'm with you.
Well, and I think, I mean, I would agree with you, Shane, that we don't necessarily agree with that stance, but it is important to make people aware that there is not any full assurance on all of this, except that we believe the intention is that you do what you can with what you've got, and the forgiveness calculation will apply how it's going to apply, and even if, even if there's this big stipulation that seems to maybe screw over a lot of people, pardon my use of that word, it is going to be something that is still a favorable circumstance of having a 1% loan that's getting you through this time. And so anyway, I do want to throw that, if anyone's feeling, stressed about that conversation, that there is comfort still there. This is still a good thing.
Yeah, I think generally, great point, Megan. I think generally people need to get, because for all we know, the guidance on forgiveness may come out 7 weeks into your 8-week period. And we've already seen the SBA and the Treasury come up with interpretations that I think we're all flabbergasted on. But I think if the principle is, if they come up with some rule and you're into this thing 7 weeks and you can't adjust for it, if you're okay, if it's still a loan, great. If for some reason that risk is not acceptable, maybe rethink taking the money in the first place, potentially.
Awesome. Well, we have several more questions. I guess I'm just doing a time check right now.
Yeah, I think we better wrap it up. If I do think that there are 2 sets of frequently asked questions on our website that are pretty thorough. One has to do with the application phase. I've already mentioned the other one that has to do with the forgiveness phase. I refer everybody to those documents, and perhaps we can just do a quick wrap up here.
Yeah, just a reminder, go over to the published Q&A and make sure that you click on the link to get updates from us, as well as if you have more questions that you feel like aren't answered, you can click the Get Help link and ask them there, and we'll get back to you on those questions so you can feel like you have your path in front of you.
All right.
If I could address just one of there's a couple of questions on the 100,000 a year. Let me just knock those out really quick. So you're only excluding 100,000 people that earn over $100,000 from your wage reduction analysis, not from the forgivable loan amount. You get to keep the first 100,000 of that person's salary as a forgivable amount. But when you're looking back at the wage reduction analysis, it says right now to exclude anyone that earned over $100,000 in that analysis of looking at wage reduction. So if someone earned 120 and then dropped to 80, they would not be included in your wage reduction, is basically what that's saying. So I hope that clarifies that.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Hey, just a few final thoughts to consider. As you've gathered from this kind of rambling discussion today of uncertainty, but by the way, when we set up this presentation, our hope was that the Treasury and the SBA had come out with their final regs. Unfortunately, they didn't. So we're making a lot of assumptions, but there's a few things I think we can count on. Number one is the forgiveness phase will be much more complex than the loan application phase. It's going to require a fair amount of modeling and analysis to make sure that you maximize your forgiveness. And there's going to be a lot more documentation that will be required. I also believe that during the forgiveness phase that there's going to be discovered some unintentional miscalculations in the amount of loans that were received. And our hope is that the banks and the SBA and all engaged will be understanding of that and adjust accordingly. An important point is start now. Reach out to a Squire representative. We're happy to assist. As you've seen, Mark had a very simple calculation, which is just a handful of employees. Now let's say you have 150 employees, and there's all types of dynamics changing and adjusting. So I think the forgiveness phase is an area that you're going to need a lot of help. And then finally, there's been a lot in the press about those that have received a loan under the certification that current economic uncertainty makes the loan request necessary to support ongoing operations. And all of the applicants made that in good faith. The Treasury and the SBA did come out with some, I don't even know what to call it, but some perhaps some political fodder. But they've said that you need to look at the liquidity of your company and other access to capital as you make that evaluation. I personally, I'm not of the opinion that your company has to be on the verge of bankruptcy to be eligible for a PPP loan, but be aware that because of the political pressure, the Treasury and the SBA are being a little more scrutinizing than I think anybody expected. And just be prepared to show during your forgiveness phase your need, for these loan funds. Mark, Megan, any final comments on that particular issue?
No.
No, I do have one final question that was asked multiple times that hopefully is a quick answer. That is, well, are you sharing the spreadsheet, the calculator spreadsheet online, or can we get a copy of it? Or what's the cost for getting a copy of said spreadsheet?
Well, we have elected to not share broadly a spreadsheet or share it, I guess, period. And the reason for that is the complexity of the spreadsheet itself is the logic built into the spreadsheet could be easily broken by a user that's not familiar with it. So if you do need some assistance, contact your Squire representative. We can work with you by inputting your numbers into the spreadsheet. Again, our initial thought was we would throw it out there and just let people use it, but upon applying it ourselves, we realized that more often than not, we're afraid that the spreadsheet will break, and you really need someone trained and familiar with the tool and how it's programmed in order for it to work effectively.
And so in order to get that help, we just want to remind everyone on our website, you can see it on the screen right now, we have a get help button. Please fill out our form and request that, add any notes you want to be specific on, and we can get you some help to walk through what we've got for you.
Thank you everybody for joining today, and we'll be back next week with another webinar, Tuesday of next week. Have a good day.